My name is Noah Lugan, and welcome to my presentation on radical early modern feminist philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft. In Part 1, we will discuss Mary Wollstonecraft's life and legacy. In Part 2, we will better learn the philosophical framework for her writing and why that's important to her most famous work, The Vindication of the Rights of Women. Part 3, we will discuss how Wollstonecraft's literary career sheds light on this period and for women as a whole. And finally, in Part 4, we will look at Mary Wollstonecraft's place within the feministic discourse. To begin, I'll go over a quick overview of her life. In 1759, she was born to a middle-class family in London. In her time, it wasn't too unlikely for women to be educated, however, it would usually occur in wealthy families. Her brothers were afforded an education, but she was not. This would not hold her back, as she became a live-in companion with a wealthy widow who helped teach her the ropes around rich, educated women. By 1787, she wrote her first book titled Thoughts on the Education of Daughters. This book added on to John Locke's work titled Some Thoughts Concerning Education, by extending Enlightenment ideals to not only men but also education. As the French Revolution was heating up, she decided to move to Paris to see the movement firsthand. Here she would write her most famous work, Vindication of the Rights of Women. However, we will come back to this. After continuing her writing career, she would give birth to a daughter named Fanny. She would sadly attempt to take her life twice, as well as shortly thereafter marrying William Godwin. Although in 1797 she dies from complications in childbirth, while giving birth to her daughter Mary. Eventually she would pursue her own writing career and write the famous Gothic novel Frankenstein. Her name was Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. During Wollstonecraft's lifetime, she had gained some notoriety. She was known for her work, The Vindication of the Rights of Women, as well as moderate success with her book called Letters Written During a Short Residence in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. This book was written on a voyage to retrieve lost merchandise of her once lover, Captain Gilbert Imlay, in an attempt to try to repair her relationship with him for the sake of the daughter they had together. However, a large amount of her works were authored anonymously with the tag M.W. She would also write with a masculine tone for these works in order to maintain credibility with a prominently male scholarly audience. After she had passed away, her new husband William Godwin was overcome with grief and wrote a tell-all memoir detailing Mary's life. This would include horrific details of her death, as well as her 2 suicide attempts, and also previously disclosed information that her first child Fanny was born out of wedlock. This would provide ammunition for her critics to discredit her works as her radical feminism being the cause of the turmoil in her life. People began to read less of her philosophical works, favoring her pieces which provided insight into her personal life. Her works were primarily relegated to radical communities which still felt her major works to be important. She would have little relevancy for around 100 years until there had been rising conversation around women's suffrage. However, the biggest revival occurred in the 1970s when 6 biographies were published about her life. These works would explore the discourse around her life, as well as connect how her life impacted the work she had written. These biographies would follow the same pattern as her husband had done by placing importance of her life as the way to understand her writing. Biographies were notably something she disliked in her life, as she felt the celebration of women in history to be ineffective, as her reasoning was something she worked towards and was achievable to other women, while she felt celebrating female heroines makes them seem to be special deified beings that makes their success seem unattainable. Most recently, more and more works have been recovered and analyzed, with many new additions to research in her life and works. Particularly, her work gives insight to women in the French Revolution on a personal and applicable manner. Additionally, she has a unique perspective on the sensibility of her time and how language around issues were navigated. She has faced much critique, however, but we will discuss that in her contribution to feminism slide. Now let's talk about Wollstonecraft's philosophical framework. As we have discussed in class, the Enlightenment was a period of philosophy centered around reason and knowledge. Wollstonecraft, being from England, was greatly immersed in British Enlightenment discourse. She had written Vindication of the Rights of Men as a retort to Edmund Burke, a conservative philosopher. Largely, however, Mary was heavily influenced by radical religious understanding, which stands out from other philosophers in this age. She believed that God had given men and women the potential to reason, but only if they equally had the opportunity could they realize their full rationality. This concept led Mary to be optimistic of the French Revolution as a republic which would allow for reason to be exercised. She lived in Paris and had written The Vindication of Rights of Women there. However, after the terror and the bloodshed began, she narrowly escaped. Her most well-known work, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, came after having written A Vindication of the Rights of Men. Starting with the titles of these two, we can see that she chooses to use the plural men and chooses to use the singular woman. This coincides with the differences she wishes to convey in these works, as within the Vindication of Men, she is reaffirming much of the Enlightenment principles such as reason and knowledge. Additionally, she places this movement in a political change in the form of a republic, which necessitates a plurality of men to facilitate. However, the Vindication of the Rights of Woman, her audience isn't necessarily a plurality, but rather speaking to the individual woman. She does this as women have been subjugated to the mindset of individuality, which does not liberate their mind, but keeps them docile for social order. So in order to speak to these women, she first has to meet them where they are, and show them that they are an individual who is not alienated from participating in society, but rather an individual which is integral to society. Women have consistently had duties which kept life functioning, such as childbirth, childhood education, tradition, memory, and much of the other aspects that we've learned in class this semester. Wollstonecraft encourages women to continue to maintain these duties, but only after having the reasoning to be able to choose whether or not to participate. By this logic, she encouraged women to gain financial independence in order to support herself if the system was unable to. Wollstonecraft had seen firsthand the failures of patriarchy if your life didn't fit the standard. With an alcoholic father and a lover who, without marriage, was not beholden to care for this child. These aspects of society which do not meet the mold leaves many women like Wollstonecraft out in the cold in favor of traditional gender roles. These aspects of women participation in society is what Wollstonecraft sought to change within the Vindication of the Rights of Women. And we see that in the differences between the Vindication of Men was specifically talking to a larger group of men who had already gained their idea of power within society, and she wanted to further that same idea of taking hold of the power that they have within society and applying it to women. Let's take a look at how this period represents an evolution in women's involvement in literature. As we've learned in class, most writing women had done consisted primarily of letters written between one another. Much of this still persisted throughout this period, but Wollstonecraft's legacy provides further information of a change in this paradigm. Just as Johnson chose to publish up-and-coming radicals such as Mary Wollstonecraft and Mary Hayes, Wollstonecraft's first work was published by Johnson and authored anonymously, just as many of Wollstonecraft's works were. The risk of publishing the works of women would first be tested by anonymous authorship. Additionally, there has been letters discovered between Wollstonecraft and fellow writer she was mentoring, Mary Hayes. Within these letters, Wollstonecraft advised Hayes on placing a masculine emphasis in her work in order to be taken more credibly by male scholars. Overall, this passing of the torch sheds light on the further of this evolution in women's literature. Wollstonecraft's contribution to feminism leaves a big question as the concept had not yet existed. Furthermore, history is complicated by the timeline of which women's place in society evolved in the 19th century. With the regressive Victorian age being a backlash to much of the work that Wollstonecraft had done to progress women in society, there is a broken line which seeks to connect modern feminism and Mary Wollstonecraft. I think that Wollstonecraft being placed within the context of her era displays how her work under different historical circumstances could have been the basis of a 19th century feminist movement. Unfortunately, this revolution did not happen until the fight for women's suffrage and subsequently the further movement in the 1970s. But I encourage you to read these quotes I've put on the slide and read Wollstonecraft's own work. See for yourself how important her work was. Thank you for listening. There's much work that has been done on Mary Wollstonecraft, and I have scoured through a mound of information about her life and works. If you're interested in further reading, I encourage you to look at the few sources on the last slide, or if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Thanks again.